He cheated on his black wife with her best friend and refused to pay child support. Betrayed, heartbroken, and left to raise their child alone, Amara never imagined her life could fall apart so quickly. But when the man who shattered her world shows up in the most unexpected place, a shocking revelation forces her to confront the past she's been trying to forget. As secrets unravel and forgiveness hangs in the balance, can Amara rebuild her life? Or will the scars of betrayal be too deep to heal? The answer lies in the most unlikely of reunions. Stay tuned and watch the story unfolds. Amara sat in the nursery, gently rocking the cradle as the soft hum of her baby's breath filled the room. Samuel, her husband, was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, but the sound of his footsteps felt distant, almost disconnected. It was supposed to be a joyous time. They had planned for this moment for years, excited to start their family after being married for 4 years. But lately, the atmosphere in the house had changed. Amara couldn't quite pinpoint it, but something about Samuel's presence felt different. It was the early days of motherhood, and Amara had imagined them as the start of a new chapter. She had always known that raising a child would come with its challenges, but the reality of it was more than she expected. Between sleepless nights and constant feedings, her body felt like a stranger to her. There were days when her thoughts were clouded, consumed by the fatigue and the emotional weight that hung heavy after childbirth. She had hoped that Samuel, her loving and doting husband, would be there to share in the load. But recently, his support had started to wane. He no longer had that tender touch when he picked up the baby or that soothing voice when he spoke to her during the night shifts. It wasn't that he was outright neglectful, but something had shifted. Amara had tried to push the feeling aside, telling herself it was just the stress of new parenthood. After all, Samuel had his own career to manage, and they were both learning how to balance their roles as parents. But as days turned into weeks, the cracks in their once solid connection became more evident. He no longer helped with the baby. Even something as simple as changing a diaper became an unspoken burden that Amara bore alone. She would sometimes sit on the edge of the bed, the baby nestled in her arms, feeling the weight of it all. She felt both overwhelmed and isolated. Samuel was still physically there, but emotionally, he was becoming a stranger. Amara told herself it was a phase, that surely, once they got into the rhythm of parenthood, things would settle. But when Samuel came home late, again and again, staying out past midnight with no real explanation, she began to wonder. The late nights had become a routine, and he seemed to avoid any serious conversation. When she asked about his day, his answers were short and unconvincing, as if he was trying to shut her out rather than connect with her. One evening, after putting the baby to bed, Amara was sitting at the dining table, folding laundry and trying to sort out her thoughts. She could hear Samuel in the shower, and it felt like an eternity before he came out. His phone was sitting on the counter, the screen glowing in the dim light. She had never been one to snoop, but something in her gut told her to take a quick glance. The words on the screen jolted her heart. "I miss you, my love. I can't wait to meet you this evening." The text also revealing the hotel address. Amara's breath caught in her throat. The words were a sharp sting in the quiet of the room. She stared at the message, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. Her mind raced, her heart pounded in her chest, and the baby, thankfully, remained peacefully asleep in the nursery. For a moment, she thought she was mistaken, but the message was clear. It wasn't a mistake. Samuel, her husband, the man she had vowed to build a future with, was texting another woman. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything she had ever imagined. But instead of confronting him in that instant, Amara made a decision. She would not approach him in the heat of the moment. No, she needed answers on her terms. The pain was almost unbearable as she quietly put the phone back and prepared herself to follow him later. The idea of confronting him head-on felt overwhelming, so she held back her emotions, hiding them beneath a mask of calm. She didn't want to make a scene or escalate things without knowing the full truth. She had to be sure. When Samuel finally left the house later that evening, Amara waited, her heart racing. She had no idea what was unfolding before her, but she had to know. She needed to follow him, to find out if this was truly happening or if her mind was playing tricks on her. In the silence of the night, Amara's thoughts swirled. She thought back to the days when she first fell in love with Samuel, the man she believed would always be her partner, her support. Now, she was left to deal with this growing suspicion, all while carrying the weight of new motherhood. But little did she know, the heartache she was about to uncover would change everything. Amara sat in the nursery, gently rocking the cradle as the soft hum of her baby's breath filled the room. Samuel, her husband, was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, but the sound of his footsteps felt distant, almost disconnected. It was supposed to be a joyous time. They had planned for this moment for years, excited to start their family after being married for 4 years. But lately, the atmosphere in the house had changed. Amara couldn't quite pinpoint it, but something about Samuel's presence felt different. It was the early days of motherhood, and Amara had imagined them as the start of a new chapter. She had always known that raising a child would come with its challenges, but the reality of it was more than she expected. Between sleepless nights and constant feedings, her body felt like a stranger to her. There were days when her thoughts were clouded, consumed by the fatigue and the emotional weight that hung heavy after childbirth. She had hoped that Samuel, her loving and doting husband, would be there to share in the load. But recently, his support had started to wane. He no longer had that tender touch when he picked up the baby or that soothing voice when he spoke to her during the night shifts. It wasn't that he was outright neglectful, but something had shifted. Amara had tried to push the feeling aside, telling herself it was just the stress of new parenthood. After all, Samuel had his own career to manage, and they were both learning how to balance their roles as parents. But as days turned into weeks, the cracks in their once solid connection became more evident. He no longer helped with the baby. Even something as simple as changing a diaper became an unspoken burden that Amara bore alone. She would sometimes sit on the edge of the bed, the baby nestled in her arms, feeling the weight of it all. She felt both overwhelmed and isolated. Samuel was still physically there, but emotionally, he was becoming a stranger. Amara told herself it was a phase, that surely, once they got into the rhythm of parenthood, things would settle. But when Samuel came home late, again and again, staying out past midnight with no real explanation, she began to wonder. The late nights had become a routine, and he seemed to avoid any serious conversation. When she asked about his day, his answers were short and unconvincing, as if he was trying to shut her out rather than connect with her. One evening, after putting the baby to bed, Amara was sitting at the dining table, folding laundry and trying to sort out her thoughts. She could hear Samuel in the shower, and it felt like an eternity before he came out. His phone was sitting on the counter, the screen glowing in the dim light. She had never been one to snoop, but something in her gut told her to take a quick glance. The words on the screen jolted her heart. "I miss you, my love. I can't wait to meet you this evening." The text also revealing the hotel address. Amara's breath caught in her throat. The words were a sharp sting in the quiet of the room. She stared at the message, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. Her mind raced, her heart pounded in her chest, and the baby, thankfully, remained peacefully asleep in the nursery. For a moment, she thought she was mistaken, but the message was clear. It wasn't a mistake. Samuel, her husband, the man she had vowed to build a future with, was texting another woman. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything she had ever imagined. But instead of confronting him in that instant, Amara made a decision. She would not approach him in the heat of the moment. No, she needed answers on her terms. The pain was almost unbearable as she quietly put the phone back and prepared herself to follow him later. The idea of confronting him head-on felt overwhelming, so she held back her emotions, hiding them beneath a mask of calm. She didn't want to make a scene or escalate things without knowing the full truth. She had to be sure. When Samuel finally left the house later that evening, Amara waited, her heart racing. She had no idea what was unfolding before her, but she had to know. She needed to follow him to find out if this was truly happening or if her mind was playing tricks on her. In the silence of the night, Amara's thoughts swirled. She thought back to the days when she first fell in love with Samuel, the man she believed would always be her partner, her support. Now, she was left to deal with this growing suspicion, all while carrying the weight of new motherhood. But little did she know, the heartache she was about to uncover would change everything. The night felt endless as Amara quietly waited, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with 100 thoughts she could barely comprehend. Samuel had left the house after dinner, just as he had on so many other nights in the past few weeks. He said he was meeting a colleague for drinks, something about work, but Amara didn't believe him. Not anymore. She had seen the message on his phone earlier, and now, all she could think about was the hotel he was heading to. She had no doubt in her mind that tonight, she would discover the truth. Amara sat in the living room for a few more minutes, pretending to go over some household bills, but the sound of her own thoughts was deafening. The quiet hum of the baby monitor was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in her mind. The baby was asleep, and Amara had managed to hide her distress long enough for the little one to drift off into slumber. But now, the weight of betrayal was so heavy, she couldn't hold it in any longer. With trembling hands, she grabbed her coat and slipped out of the house. She didn't want to confront Samuel in their home. No, she had to follow him, track him, and confront him on her terms. She needed to see it for herself. This wasn't about trust anymore. It was about proving that the man she loved, the man she had built a life with, had shattered everything. She needed closure, even if it tore her apart. The drive to the hotel felt like an eternity. Amara's mind was numb, but she couldn't stop herself from thinking of all the times she had trusted Samuel, the man she had been with for so long. The memories of their laughter, their plans for the future, the hope of growing old together, all of it felt like a distant dream now. As she arrived at the hotel, the parking lot seemed unusually quiet. The city lights outside cast long shadows on the ground, and the flickering neon signs seemed to mock her as she pulled into a spot. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she stared at the entrance. This was it, the moment she had been dreading, but also the one she knew she had to face. Amara took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. She was terrified, but determination filled her. She couldn't walk away now, not after everything that had happened. She knew this was a turning point in her life. She could no longer deny what had been happening behind her back. The lobby of the hotel was quiet, with only a few people milling around. Amara's footsteps echoed on the polished floor as she walked to the elevator, her heart in her throat. She pressed the button for the top floor, where she suspected Samuel was meeting someone. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Amara stepped inside, her reflection staring back at her from the shiny metal surface. She barely recognized herself. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale, and the weight of the moment hung on her like a dark cloud. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and she stepped out into a hallway lined with plush carpets and muted lights. She didn't have to search long. The door to a suite at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, and Amara's heart skipped a beat when she saw Samuel standing inside, his back to her. But it wasn't just him. Standing beside him was someone she knew all too well. Tasha, her best friend, the woman she had confided in, trusted, and called a sister. The woman who had been a part of her life for years. And now, here she was, wrapped in Samuel's arms, the two of them embracing in a way that Amara had never seen before. The sight of it hit Amara like a punch to the gut. She felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under her, and her body went numb. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The betrayal was more than just the affair. It was the complete shattering of everything she had believed in. Tasha had been the one person she thought she could count on, and now she was the one betraying her trust in the most intimate way possible. Amara stood frozen in the doorway, unable to speak. The weight of the moment made her feel as though her legs would give out beneath her. Finally, when the shock began to wear off, her voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. Samuel, Tasha. They both turned toward her, their faces a mixture of surprise and guilt. Samuel's eyes widened, and for a split second, Amara thought she saw something resembling shame flicker across his face. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by something colder, more defensive. "What are you doing here, Amara?" Samuel's voice was sharp, like a knife cutting through the heavy silence between them. "Go home." Amara's heart shattered all over again. She expected anger, maybe even a tearful confession, but what she got instead was indifference. Samuel's coldness was the final blow. He didn't care. Not about her, not about their child. It was as if everything they had built was meaningless to him now. Tasha stood there, unable to meet Amara's gaze. Her eyes were cast downward, her face flushed with shame. But there was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. She just stood there, awkward and silent. Amara's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand tall. "So this is how it is?" Her voice cracked, but she held herself together with everything she had left. "This is how you repay me? After everything? After our years together?" Samuel didn't answer. He just crossed his arms, his eyes hardening. "You've had your chance. I'm done." Tasha finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am sorry, Amara. I never meant for it to go this far." The words felt hollow. The apology meant nothing now. Amara looked from Tasha to Samuel, but it was as if the people she had trusted with her life were strangers. She couldn't stay there any longer. She turned and walked out of the hotel, her heart breaking with every step. As Amara made her way back to her car, her body felt heavy, her mind spinning. The hurt was so deep, so raw, that it felt like a wound that would never heal. She didn't know how she would face him when he returned home, but the truth was clear. Samuel had chosen Tasha. He had made his decision, and there was no going back. The days that followed were a blur. Amara cried herself to sleep every night, feeling the weight of the betrayal settle deep within her. Samuel came home late, as usual, but this time there was no pretending. He didn't even look at her. The silence between them was suffocating. Weeks passed, and Amara's grief turned into something else, something darker. Samuel filed for divorce. When he handed her the papers, it felt like the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. Amara had expected the pain, but nothing could have prepared her for how it felt to have everything ripped away from her so coldly. She agreed to sign the papers, but only on one condition. She demanded child support. She had quit her job as a nurse to care for their baby, and now she was left with nothing. Samuel's response was as heartless as everything else. He looked at her, his expression vacant. "I will not pay you child support," he said, his words cutting through her like glass. Amara couldn't believe it. She had never imagined that the man she had loved would be capable of such cruelty. But the man she had married was gone, replaced by a stranger who showed no remorse, no compassion. Amara sat in the waiting area outside the courtroom, her palms sweating as she gripped the edges of the chair. The steady hum of fluorescent lights above seemed to mock her, and the cold steel of the metal benches felt like a reminder of the legal battle ahead. She couldn't believe she was here. She had never imagined a day like this, fighting her ex-husband in court just to get the support she needed to raise their child. The papers had been signed. The divorce had been finalized, but the sting of Samuel's betrayal hadn't dulled. It had only grown sharper with each passing day. He had refused to pay child support, a cruel refusal that left Amara no choice but to take legal action. Her mother, the only family she had left to turn to, had offered her a place to stay, but living with her mother wasn't ideal. Amara wanted independence, a life of her own. She wanted to give her baby a stable home, but Samuel had made that impossible. Amara could still feel the weight of his words when he told her he would not pay a single dime in child support. "I will not pay you child support," he had said with such coldness. It felt as if he had ripped the last shred of decency from their marriage. She couldn't understand how the man she had once loved so deeply could be so heartless. Her lawyer, a woman who had been patient and supportive through the process, sat beside her, reviewing the documents one last time. "Remember," her lawyer said, "we're asking for the court to enforce what's rightfully owed to you and your child. This isn't personal. It's about ensuring your child's future." Amara nodded, though the words felt empty in her ears. She could barely think of the future without feeling overwhelmed by the weight of the present. The idea of standing up to Samuel in this way felt strange, almost like she was fighting a battle she had never chosen to begin with. But she had no choice. She had to keep fighting. For her baby, for herself. When it was time for her to take the stand, Amara's legs shook as she walked into the courtroom. The room was cold and sterile, its walls filled with the quiet murmur of lawyers, clients, and spectators. Samuel was already seated at the opposite table, his lawyer whispering in his ear, his face tight with impatience. He didn't look up as Amara took her seat. He hadn't even acknowledged her presence since the divorce was filed. The judge, an older man with a stern face, called the proceedings to order. Amara's lawyer stood first, presenting her case. She spoke with clarity and conviction, laying out the facts of their marriage, the birth of their child, and the responsibilities Samuel had failed to uphold. She spoke about the financial strain Amara was facing, the sacrifices she had made, and the refusal of Samuel to contribute in any way. As the lawyer spoke, Amara's heart pounded in her chest. It was hard to hear her own life being dissected like this, but she knew it had to be done. Then it was Samuel's turn. His lawyer presented evidence of his so-called financial hardship. The documents he submitted claimed he had no assets, no savings, and no means to pay child support. Amara's stomach dropped as Samuel sat there, looking so composed, as though he were the victim. She knew it was all lies. Samuel was well off, always had been, and it was clear he was trying to hide his wealth. Amara's lawyer, sharp as ever, immediately countered. "Your Honor, these documents are falsified," she said, her voice steady. "We have evidence that Samuel has been transferring assets into different accounts, liquidating properties, and making transactions to conceal his wealth. His claim of financial hardship is an attempt to avoid his obligations." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and Samuel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't make eye contact with Amara, but she could feel the guilt hanging in the air. His attempt to deceive the court wasn't going to work. His lies were unraveling in front of him. The judge listened carefully, weighing the evidence. He glanced at Samuel, then back at Amara, before asking the opposing side to present any further documentation. Samuel's lawyer shuffled through the papers, but it was clear that the case was falling apart for him. The court wasn't buying Samuel's story. As the hearing progressed, Samuel grew more restless. He was cornered, and he knew it. It was only a matter of time before the court ruled in Amara's favor. But Samuel wasn't done. In a desperate bid to avoid paying, he did the unthinkable. He liquidated assets he owned, sold property, and moved out of the state, leaving Amara with no way to track him or hold him accountable. It was a cowardly escape, but one that seemed to give him the breathing room he needed. Amara's heart sank when she received the news. She couldn't believe it. Samuel had abandoned her and their child, not only emotionally, but financially as well. He had disappeared, fleeing to another state to avoid the consequences of his actions. The court's ruling was still pending, but now, Amara had no idea where Samuel had gone or how to reach him. She was left with the bitter reality that her ex-husband had once again shown her just how far he was willing to go to avoid responsibility. And the pain of his abandonment was compounded by the fact that he had left her without a financial lifeline, forcing her to lean on her mother for support once again. Amara's life felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Her dreams of independence and stability seemed further away than ever. But she knew she had to keep moving forward. She had no choice but to pick up the pieces and find a way to survive. The cold rejection from Samuel still stung, but Amara knew one thing for certain. She would not give up. She had her child to care for, and no matter how hard it got, she would keep fighting. She would find a way to build a life for herself and her baby, no matter where Samuel was or what he chose to do. The battle in court had left its scars, but Amara was determined not to let her ex-husband's lies and abandonment define her. She would rebuild, step by painful step, for herself and for the child she loved more than anything in the world. Amara stood in front of the mirror, the reflection staring back at her a far cry from the woman she had been just a few months ago. Her face had softened, the dark circles under her eyes starting to fade as she began to reclaim some semblance of herself. It had been a long road, filled with more pain than she thought she could ever endure. But she was still here, and that was something. She had found a job at a rehab center for recovering addicts, a place that, in a strange way, offered her both the escape and the purpose she so desperately needed. It wasn't easy. Nothing about her life was easy anymore. But it was something. It was a fresh start, a step toward rebuilding what had been broken. Her first day had been overwhelming. She had arrived early, feeling a mixture of anxiety and hope, unsure of how she would be received. But as soon as she walked into the bustling center, there was a sense of purpose in the air. The work was hard, emotionally and physically draining, but Amara didn't shy away. She threw herself into it, keeping her focus on the patients, her care, and the small victories they celebrated each day. She found solace in the daily routines, taking vital signs, administering medication, assisting with therapies. It wasn't just the tasks that kept her going, though. It was the patients. Each of them was on their own journey, struggling with addiction, fighting for their lives. And in a way, Amara felt she was fighting for hers too. Caring for these patients, hearing their stories, witnessing their struggles, helped her process her own pain. It gave her a purpose beyond her broken marriage and the mess that Samuel had left behind. Her colleagues, too, had become a surprising source of support. At first, they treated her with the distance one might expect from a new hire, polite, professional, but reserved. But over time, Amara's dedication began to shine through. She wasn't just doing her job. She was doing it with compassion, with care, with a commitment that spoke volumes. Her colleagues began to notice, and slowly, their respect for her grew. One afternoon, as she was finishing up a shift, her supervisor, Claire, pulled her aside. "Amara," she said, a warm smile spreading across her face, "I just wanted to take a moment to thank you. Your work here has been incredible. You brought something special to this place." Amara blinked, taken aback by the compliment. She hadn't expected this, hadn't even realized how much of a difference her presence had made. "I'm just doing my job," Amara replied softly, her voice filled with humility. But inside, something stirred. She felt a sense of pride, a spark of confidence that she hadn't felt in so long. It was the first time in months that someone had recognized her for her hard work and dedication, not as a wife or a mother or a woman scorned, but as Amara, a person in her own right. As the weeks passed, Amara began to feel more at ease in the center. She learned to navigate the complexities of the patient's needs, the demands of her job, and most importantly, the balance of caring for others while still caring for herself. Every day, she felt herself growing stronger, more resilient, more capable of handling whatever life threw her way. There were still moments of deep sorrow, nights when the weight of her past would settle in her bones, and she would lie awake, thinking of Samuel and the life they had once dreamed of together. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined her. The work at the rehab center allowed her to focus on something tangible. It gave her a space to channel her grief into something meaningful. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and that made all the difference. Her colleagues continued to support her. Some shared their own stories of hardship and recovery, creating an unspoken bond of mutual respect and understanding. Others admired her strength, offering quiet words of encouragement, reminding her that her resilience was an inspiration. They treated her not as a victim of her circumstances, but as someone who had overcome them, someone who was moving forward. With every shift, with every patient she helped, Amara felt herself healing just a little more. She didn't know where the future would lead, or what her life would look like in a year, or even in 6 months. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She felt like she could breathe again, like the world wasn't as dark as it had once seemed. And as she walked out of the rehab center at the end of each day, her heart a little lighter, she realized that she was no longer the woman who had been left broken by betrayal. She was a woman rebuilding her life, piece by piece. And for the first time in a long time, she felt proud of who she was becoming. Amara had grown accustomed to the daily rhythm of the rehab center, checking in on patients, administering medications, and managing routines. The work had become second nature to her, providing structure and a sense of purpose. But that morning, everything shifted. A new patient arrived. The staff was immediately wary. The man was in dire condition, covered in dirt, weak and unkempt. His clothes were torn, his skin pale and bruised, and his eyes vacant as though the light had long since left them. His movements were sluggish, as if his body could no longer keep up with the world around him. He was placed on a stretcher, his body limp and fragile, and the hospital staff exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do with him. No one seemed eager to care for this new patient. "He's going to need a lot of attention," one of the nurses muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "It's probably too late for him." Amara, though, didn't hesitate. She had seen patients in much worse conditions, people broken by addiction, by life, by mistakes. She knew the signs, the way hopelessness could sink into a person's soul, but she also knew the power of healing. Her heart went out to the man, though she didn't know why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was her desire to fix what had once been broken in herself. "I'll take care of him," she said firmly, surprising everyone in the room. As she began to clean him up, the smell of sweat, alcohol, and something darker filled the air. His hair was matted, his skin was cracked and dry. The bruises on his face told their own grim story. She worked in silence, her hands gentle but swift, cleaning away the filth and grime that had accumulated over weeks, maybe longer. His condition was grave, but she had seen worse, much worse, and she would do whatever it took to help him, even if it was only for a fleeting moment. Her mind was focused on the task at hand, but something in the way his features shifted as she worked began to unsettle her. There was something oddly familiar about him, but she couldn't place it. His eyes were dull, empty, but beneath the surface, something sparked, something she couldn't quite understand. As she continued cleaning him, Amara's breath caught in her throat when she noticed the scars on his arms, the slight tremor in his hands as she moved them. A sickness in her stomach twisted tighter, and then, as she reached up to carefully remove a piece of debris from his hair, her eyes locked onto his face, truly locked onto it for the first time. It was Samuel, her estranged husband, the man who had betrayed her, divorced her, and left her to raise their child alone, was lying before her, broken and vulnerable in ways she never thought she would see. The man who had once been so full of life, the man who had shattered her heart, was now a shadow of the person he used to be. His eyes fluttered open, barely focusing, his lips moving in silent words she couldn't understand. Her heart pounded in her chest, a strange mix of emotions flooding through her. Shock, disbelief, anger. But above all, there was something else, a quiet, painful pity that she couldn't suppress. Seeing him like this, reduced to a broken shell, was like watching a tragedy unfold before her eyes. But this was no longer the man she had loved. This was a man in pain, a man who had been destroyed by his own choices, by the life he had chosen to lead. For a long time, he didn't recognize her. She continued to care for him, checking his vitals, ensuring he was comfortable, though her mind was racing. How had it come to this? How had Samuel, once so proud, so arrogant, fallen so far? What had happened in the months since she had last seen him? It wasn't until a week later, after days of treatment and medication, that something began to shift. Samuel's mind cleared, his strength returning slowly as the fog of his addiction began to lift. His eyes, once clouded and distant, began to focus on the world around him. And then, one day, his gaze met hers. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Samuel blinked, as though struggling to place her. But then, recognition dawned on his face, and with it, a flood of emotions, shock, regret, and shame. Amara. His voice was raspy, barely a whisper. He blinked again, as though seeing her for the first time in years. Is it really you? Amara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She hadn't expected to feel so much, but here he was, in front of her, looking nothing like the man who had walked away from her with no apology, no remorse. This broken man before her was a far cry from the one who had betrayed her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. I didn't know what I was doing. I was weak. I lost everything, and I lost you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. There was no anger in her. Instead, she felt the weight of the years that had passed since their last conversation. Samuel wasn't the man who had walked away from her so cruelly. He wasn't the man who had abandoned their family without a second thought. This was a man broken by his own choices, a man who had fallen apart when he lost everything, including himself. "I don't know where to begin," he continued, his eyes filling with tears. "Tasha, she introduced me to drugs, and from there it was a downhill spiral. Gambling addiction. I lost everything. My career, my money. And when I had nothing left, she left me, too." Amara could barely hold back the tears that welled up in her eyes. She had heard the words, had known on some level that the man who had once been her husband had crumbled. But to hear it from his lips, to see the remorse in his eyes, was almost more than she could bear. "I've ruined everything, Amara," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I ruined us, and now I don't even know if I can fix it." The pain of the past came rushing back, but with it came something unexpected: forgiveness. Not for him, but for her own peace. She had carried the weight of his betrayal for so long. But now, seeing him like this, broken and regretful, she understood something deeper. Forgiving him didn't mean letting him back in her life. It didn't mean forgetting what he had done, but it meant letting go of the anger, letting go of the past. Amara took a deep breath, her hand gently resting on his. "You can't fix everything, Samuel," she said softly, her voice steady. "But you can try to make things right, for yourself, for your future. I've already moved on. I'm taking care of our child, and I'm rebuilding my life." Samuel nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I will spend every day trying to earn your forgiveness, if you'll ever allow me that chance." Amara said nothing for a long time. She wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, she felt a strange sense of closure. The man who had hurt her so deeply was now the man who was admitting his faults and owning up to his mistakes. It was more than she could have ever expected, but it was also a beginning, for him and for her. The days following Samuel's confession felt surreal to Amara. She had heard him speak the words, his apology, his admissions of guilt, his explanation of the downward spiral he had gone through, but she was still processing it all. The man who had once been the center of her world, the man who had betrayed her in ways that had left her broken and isolated, was now in front of her, vulnerable and remorseful. He was a shadow of the man she had once known, but there was something in his eyes now, something she hadn't seen in years. Regret. A genuine, raw regret. Amara sat beside him on the edge of the bed, her fingers lightly brushing the back of his hand. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the Ford machine and the occasional rustle of sheets as Samuel shifted. His body had started to recover from the ravages of addiction, but it was his mind that needed the most healing. She wasn't sure if he could ever fully atone for what he had done, but the man before her was trying. Truly trying. She could see the damage he had done to himself. But even as the man before her was recovering, she wondered, was it too late for them? She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had spent so many nights angry, so many days consumed by the betrayal, letting it fester inside her. But now, sitting in front of him, the anger didn't seem as sharp as it once had. The bitterness was still there, but it had softened, twisted into something else. Pity. A strange, unexpected pity for the man who had lost everything, including himself. "I don't know what to say, Samuel." Amara finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "What you did to me, what you did to us, it hurt. It still hurts. And I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you for everything. But I realized something." She paused, gathering her thoughts. This wasn't something she had expected to feel, but there was a clarity in her heart she hadn't had before. Holding on to this anger, this resentment, it's been eating at me. I've carried it for so long, and it's made me bitter. It's poisoned me in ways I didn't even realize until now. Her gaze softened, a faint sigh escaping her lips. I'm not forgiving you for your sake, Samuel. I'm forgiving you for mine, so I can move forward, so I can be at peace. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Samuel didn't speak. He only stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he nodded, his lips trembling slightly. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but thank you. Thank you for giving me that. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to prove that I can be better, that I can be the man I should have been. Amara wasn't sure what the future would hold. She wasn't under any illusions about who Samuel was or the pain he had caused. But in that moment, as she looked at him, a man who had been through the worst and was trying to rebuild, she felt a shift. It wasn't a grand epiphany, nor was it a sudden burst of hope, but it was enough to know that maybe, just maybe, they could start again. As the days passed, Samuel's recovery continued. He began to regain strength, not just physically, but emotionally as well. His eyes, once clouded with shame and guilt, began to clear. And slowly, Amara started to see glimpses of the man he once was. Not the man who had hurt her, but the man who had been full of promise and potential. He was still flawed, still deeply scarred by his actions, but there was a sincerity in his efforts now that had been absent before. Amara watched him as he worked through the therapy sessions, as he struggled to find his footing once more. He was trying, and that was all she could ask of him. But the more she saw, the more she realized that she, too, was healing. She had put so much of herself into raising their child and rebuilding her life, and now she was beginning to rebuild with him. Slowly, cautiously, but with an openness she hadn't had before. One evening, after Samuel had finished a therapy session, he sat down beside her on the couch, looking at her with a new level of respect. I know I can never erase what I did, but if you're willing to try, if you'll let me, I want to be part of your life again. Not as the man I was, but as someone who's willing to fight for us, for our family. Amara met his gaze, her heart fluttering with a mix of uncertainty and hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it. Not as the woman who had been betrayed, but as the woman who had chosen to forgive. Not for Samuel's sake, but for her own peace. Let's take it one day at a time, she said softly. We can rebuild, but it will take time. And we'll do it together, but only if we're both ready to make it work. And with that, they began anew. Not as the same couple they once were, but as two people who had endured hardship, growth, and forgiveness. They were different, stronger, more resilient. But together, they were ready to rebuild their family. And this time, they would do it right. If this story touched your heart, like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful, soul-touching stories that restore faith in humanity.